According to leaked Pentagon documents earlier this year, a Canadian natural gas company was hit in a cyber attack launched by Russian-backed hackers. The details aren't clear, but it was a wake-up call for how well defended sensitive infrastructure is in this country. With us now for more in Belfast, Northern Ireland, Rajiv Gupta, Associate Head of the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. In New York, Bhushan Ivaturi, Senior Vice President and Chief Information Officer at Enbridge. And in the nation's capital, Stephanie Carvin, Associate Professor of International Relations at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs and a former national security analyst. Welcome to you all. Rajiv, I'm going to start with you. The Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity issued a warning when the threat was first detected. What can you tell us about the incident?
Sure. We don't comment on the specifics or on alleged leaked documents, but what I can comment on is the alert that we did put out and the notification that we put out to critical infrastructure. So earlier this year, we did put out a cyber flash to critical infrastructure partners within Canada, talking about an incident that we were aware of where a critical infrastructure operator had been compromised by a threat actor. And in this situation, the threat actor had the potential to actually cause physical damage by the access that they had. So it's very important for us to flag that, to take the information that we learned from the incident and actually share that with critical infrastructure operators across Canada.
Bhushan, I want to come to you. In terms of, give us an idea, is the oil and gas sector routinely targeted by cyber criminals and state-backed leaders, or hackers rather?
Well, it is, and we're being critical infrastructure always a source of attack, but I can confirm that Enbridge was not hacked or breached, and we do maintain a very strong partnership in collaboration with the government, so with the Canadian as well as the U.S. security agencies. And part of this is all about making sure that we are sharing the threat intelligence in a more proactive manner so we can take proactive action to address or mitigate any threats.
So I just want to confirm that Enbridge is not the natural gas company at the center of this breach.
That is right.
All right, Stephanie. One of the last times you were on the program, you were talking about pipelines and the Colonial Pipeline in specific, one that was a successful cyber attack, a victim of. Give us an idea. Cyber criminals, do they look at oil and gas? Is this an industry that is normally targeted?
Yeah, that Colonial Pipeline attack, it's different from what this alleged attack actually is. In that particular case, it was a ransomware attack, and I don't believe it actually hit the industrial control systems or the systems that basically control the pressure, the flow, the distribution of oil. And it seems to, I think, have attacked kind of the billing department. And so it's a very different kind of attack. It's where basically criminals are able to encrypt information and then stop computers from working and those kinds of things. Then you have to pay a ransom in order to get basically your data back or access to your computers back. In this particular case, what's being alleged is something far more serious. It is something that could have potentially, as been said, caused physical destruction, right? Mm-hmm. So something that could have caused an explosion. Some of the media reports on this, a leak basically suggests that this could have potentially even have caused loss of life. So what we're talking about here is an actual kind of physical attack. And to your point, this is something that does happen regularly in the sector, or at least attempts to do this happen in the sector. We've been, I think, fairly lucky. The intelligence reports allegedly say that this would, if this attack had been successful, it would have been the first time we would have seen something like an industrial control system successfully attacked by Russia. But, even going back 10 years ago, there was the Telvent incident, right, which was an attack. It's allegedly China was able to actually get into the smart grid of Telvent's pipelines, which could have caused similar kinds of damage in terms of flows and things like this. That fortunately was detected and stopped at the time. But it goes to show that, these kinds of attacks, aspirational or successful, have been plotted for now well over a decade.
All right, let's add some international context into this. Rajiv, I'm hoping you can explain, how does the Russian war in Ukraine factor into these threats?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, the geopolitical tensions that we saw there, and then the actual conflict itself was certainly something that we tracked carefully at the Cyber Center. So, I mean, threats to oil and gas can come from a number of different sources. So they could be from cyber criminals, right? They want to make money because they can, basically ransomware a gas company and then have them pay money because they can't afford to be down. It can come from hacktivists, right? It can come from espionage. They want to learn information about the gas company or its exploration and whatnot. But in this case here, we're looking at the geopolitical context. And what states do is they tend to preposition or perform reconnaissance against oil and gas companies and other energy organizations as well. And we've been warning about that from the Cyber Center since about 2018 in our first national cyber threat assessment. So we've been upping those warnings year after year. It's a way of projection of power for the states. And when you start to get into geopolitical conflict, the stakes just rise even higher, right? So if you look back to before the conflict, in December, we had put out, this is 2021, we made a conscious effort to actually talk about ransomware. And we actually had 4 ministers sign an open letter to Canadians talking about the threat of ransomware. And as you know, there are many, ransomware groups that are Russian in this space. We actually talked about the threats to operational technologies in that December as well. So we put out a threat bulletin on threats to operational technologies. And these are the technologies that actually, have the physical ability to control things within the oil and gas industry. So as they become more and more connected to the internet, that threat surface grows and threat actors actually look at that, right? So we were very concerned about making sure that that organizations were aware of this threat. And then as we got closer to the actual conflict, which was February 24th, we were getting more and more concerned as a Cyber Center. And in January, we actually put out an urgent call saying, I believe it said the Cyber Center urges critical infrastructure operators to act. And we did put out the threat to critical infrastructure, talking about the fact that there might be repercussions from the war. And that was based off of the history, right? So in 2017, we'd seen Russia use a piece of malware called NotPetya that was meant to target Ukraine, but it really had just basically impacted about another 60 countries around the world. So it was a really indiscriminate use of malware that led to pretty severe consequences. And CSE was happy to attribute this activity to Russia and call it out along with many of our partners. So we were worried. We put out the warnings. The geopolitical context was certainly a motivation for us to up the vigilance in the critical infrastructure sectors. And we reached out to our partners who we work very closely with, because really Cyber Defense of Canada is a collaborative effort. We need to work very closely with the critical infrastructure operators, the security service providers, and that is how we defend our nation. Cyber is a little different from traditional military. It's a joint effort, and this is how we defend our country.
With all that being said, Bhushan, I want to ask you, Enbridge, one of the largest natural gas companies in North America, are you and other companies in the gas and oil sector on high alert? And what does that actually mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Rajiv covered it well, right? The context of geopolitics and the heightened threat landscape. So all that to say, critical infrastructure and energy in particular is a source of target. In Canada, in North American energy, we're a major energy provider to the world, but also not just in production, but also the potential. And we do this energy in a very responsible way. So I think it's absolutely a target. And we've got, very overt cybercrime groups in addition to nation states, such as ransomware groups that have quite declared targeting those countries, and specifically operators in Canada and the US and the NATO allies. So I think it's something that happens all the time, which really goes back to making sure that we heighten and adjust our level of capability in response to this threat landscape. So our partnership with Rajiv and Canadian, as well as the US authorities, our ability to get intelligence about threats, and our capabilities around 24/7 monitoring, as well as being able to take proactive actions to mitigate these threats, are a key part of how we adapt and adjust to this increasing threat landscape.
Stephanie, why Canada? Why was Canada targeted?
That's such an interesting question, and it's one I'd love to know. I mean, we know that this attack happened, but we don't know why it happened or why it was a target. I mean, as Rajiv has said correctly, the Cyber Center has been warning about this for some time, that, there's a number of malicious actors that have been targeting Canada in this way, sitting on our systems, or at least trying to probe them in looking for opportunities, right? That, one day they may want to actually use them. And in fact, I believe the Cyber Center language was that you may want to use them in the case of an armed conflict. Well, guess what? There's now an armed conflict that Russia very much sees us a part of. And so there's a number of questions here rather than answers. I think the first question is, was this just simply opportunistic? Did this hacking group suddenly see an opportunity to exploit this particular company and decided to take it? Or was this actually something that was ordered? And was it ordered because, Canada is not in the EU, and we're certainly not the United States? I think Canada does punch above its weight in cyber, but certainly the US is still the leading country when it comes to, cyber offense, I think. So, were we kind of the low-hanging fruit, somewhat a country to be made examples of? It's not clear. We don't have answers to those questions, but none of them are particularly great. None of those are really great scenarios. I have to say, the thing that really does concern me about this group, Zarya, I think I'm saying that correctly, but they seem to have been kind of a group that defaced websites and engaged in kind of low-level hacking attacks called DDoS attacks. Now, they were becoming more sophisticated. They were using more sophisticated malware in doing so, but what's really disturbing here, and when we add this to the question of why Canada, is they seem to have upscaled their capabilities very, very quickly, right? They were part of a larger hacking group called Killnet, which was a Russian hacking group. They seem to have gone their own way. But they seem to have gained this ability. I mean, the difference between defacing a website or just blocking traffic to a website, something we actually saw here in Canada at the same time we were learning about these attacks, is it's a skill, but actually attacking a critical infrastructure and going after the industrial control systems or the supervisory control and data acquisition systems is another level. And so the fact that this group was able to skill up so quickly is, I think, pretty disturbing. Either they were able to access capabilities that they didn't previously have, or they were given some assistance or some other situation. But again, none of this is great.
I want to ask you a follow-up. Should Canada be concerned at all with its relations after this attack with the U.S. or other countries? You mentioned low-hanging fruit, but are we a weak link in that, and should that be a concern?
That's another interesting question. Of course, we're learning so much out of these intelligence leaks. We seem to be learning more from them than we normally would about our own foreign and national security policies, and one of them being that Canada is apparently seen as kind of a weak player in terms of its national security and foreign and defense policy, because we don't invest a lot in it, right? That apparently Prime Minister Trudeau basically said to our allies that we will never hit the 2% NATO target as a part of our GDP. That is, that doesn't shine well with our allies. Now, that being said, I really do have the impression that when it comes to cyber, Canada does punch above its weight, and we really are there, and we are an active member with our Five Eyes partners. And I have no doubt that if, I don't know if it was the Americans who first discovered this group was planning an attack, or if the Canadians were able to figure it out ourselves. But the fact is, there's a lot of intelligence sharing, there's a lot of cooperation, and I have no doubt that if it came to an attack where we needed the assistance of our allies, that our allies would be there. The other aspects of our foreign policy, maybe we could work on, but in terms of cyber, I mean, not to make Rajiv look too good in this conversation, but I think actually we're doing pretty well.
All right, Rajiv, I am going to ask you, when the Cyber Center is alerted of a potential threat to critical infrastructure, what happens next? Walk us through that.
Yeah, so basically the center learns about threats in a number of different ways, right? So we defend the government of Canada. So sometimes we see threats through our aperture in terms of defending the government of Canada. we are part of CSC. So CSC is actually very good at signals intelligence, and we get a lot of information from our own Canadian intelligence, I will say, as well as through our relationships with our flyby partners, which is very strong. And to Stephanie's point earlier, we have a very close relationship on cyber. We work very closely together. I was just on a panel with CISA and the NCSC, which are our two cyber center partners in the US and the UK, and we're basically communicate on a daily basis. So I just wanted to reiterate that that's a really strong partnership. So we get information from our partners. We get information from certs right around the world as well. So we are the National Cert of Canada. So these are other tips that can come in. So lots of different sources of information. And as soon as we get these, it's basically a urgent effort, because this could be ransomware that we've been notified that might be happening on a Canadian or organization or whatnot. So it's critical that we actually reach out to these organizations ASAP, and our folk work like day and night to be able to do this. It's not always easy. Sometimes we have the contacts in place already, as we do with Enbridge and others, where we know the people and we can actually reach out in a very collaborative way. But sometimes it's an organization that we've never worked with before, and we have to reach out a number of different ways and try our best to highlight the urgency and get the right people to actually respond to the incident. And hopefully all the actions get to happen before anything critical takes place. And that does happen quite often. So these are really amazing success stories that you never hear. We're able to prevent these ransomware attacks and others that are there. But it's basically a daily occurrence for the Cyber Center in terms of us, learning of some sort of threat and then doing the urgent job of actually reaching out and notifying our partners to make sure that we can work collaboratively to mitigate. So that's a day in our life.
Now, I do want to ask you a question. It's not a question to pat yourself on the back, essentially, but I want to know response times. Like, how fast can you be alerted of some potential threat, and then say for the sake of this example, we have Enbridge. How fast can we quickly get in contact with Enbridge? How quickly can we sort of negate the potential for an attack?
Yeah, in terms of Enbridge, that could be minutes. That's as good as a chat message or an email over to Bhushan, and then having the teams actually start to work and exchange that actual information. One thing that I will say as well, that in terms of those are the notifications that we put out on a very urgent and timely basis, but on an hourly basis, we're actually automatically sharing threat indicators as well that help people detect threats on their own network. So we have lots of different info sharing techniques and methods that we put on nonstop, whether they're cyber flashes, alerts, publications, these sorts of things. So there's various levels of them, and we make sure that information is flowing nonstop, because that's really the core of having this kind of collaborative defense of the country.
All right, very impressive. Bhushan.
Well, I can add in, I can confirm that, I was on a plane to Idaho, going to the Idaho National Labs, and I got the phone and the text from the Cyber Center. And within seconds after that, because we have a 24/7, 365, monitoring and mitigation capability, we were already mobilized. So I think that a level of connection and information sharing is working quite well.
Bhushan, I want to ask you, Stephanie had touched on it a little bit. There is a difference between gaining access to a company's network and actually disrupting energy supply or causing damage. If hackers do succeed in getting access to our pipeline infrastructure, can you give us a sense what could happen, mild scenario to worst case scenario?
Yeah, I think, this gets into varying degrees, and maybe, if I step back to just put in context. So, we've seen in the news, right, varying levels of impact when critical infrastructure services are impacted. So, that encompasses healthcare. And the Irish health system, as an example, went through a ransomware attack, and you see, what happened there. So it could be from, people being able to not access the health system or book their appointments, or the energy, the Colonial Pipeline that Stephanie just kind of talked about, and what that means in terms of society, or even the critical infrastructure around food supply, right? So when JBS Foods, et cetera, went through. So I think it depends. And I think what really that means is, for us at Enbridge, really underscores the constant ability to not just have our eyes on the landscape of the threat and its sophistication, but also make sure that we're adapting and matching and investing our capabilities to take the appropriate action, be it to identify, be it to detect, be it to prevent, to protect, and also, making sure that we have an appropriate response. So that's the way we think about it, and this includes taking several actions. For example, we continuously test and validate the effectiveness of our controls. We take appropriate architectural decisions around providing layers of defense. So it's not, one layer that is compromised that we stop business operations, rather making sure that we have these architectural principles that are sound and are constantly validated. We perform hacking exercises. We hire independent third parties to perform what are called red team and purple team hacking exercises, so we can, again, proactively assess and take actions to mitigate our capability. And then we, of course, do numerous drills around business continuity. So that's a way we think about making sure that we continue to operate the critical infrastructure that is so important for our society and really empowers our society.
Stephanie, best case, worst case scenarios. You touched on it a little bit. What does that look like?
Well, I guess when I first read about this, all I could think about was a disruption to the natural gas supply in February in Canada, which could be very serious. Also, the idea that there could have even been loss of life, right? I mean, people could have potentially have died in an explosion if the original intent or the alleged intent of these attackers had actually gone through, and that's incredibly serious. But the energy, obviously, it's pretty resilient, and we've put a lot of resources in it. The government of Canada itself is also introducing legislation, Bill C-26, which is going to see the introduction of agile cybersecurity standards to make sure that more players are also keeping up in the way that, say, Enbridge says it is, which is great. But it really could be a very just from an actual loss of life perspective, that would have been bad. The idea that our energy might have, I don't know which companies. So if it was a major company or versus a small company, that would have had an impact on potentially the natural gas in Canada, which, to a certain extent, we also are under a pressure from our allies to start exporting more. And then also, I think the diplomatic signal this says. I mean, we have to understand cyber attacks as a language. Right. When Russia was attacking Ukraine's energy grid, with Black Energy back in a few years ago, this wasn't just like a way to punish Ukraine. It was a way to also communicate with them, to inculcate a sense of helplessness. And so there's these diplomatic costs as well. And this is why I think it is important for, Canada to take this seriously and to, respond in a way that I think is appropriate, which might be some kind of, say, cyber attribution or, working with our allies to call out this kind of behavior. I don't know if we would go so far as to actually respond in some kind of way, but certainly things like increased sanctions or targeting other individuals, indicting them with criminal offenses for having done this. These are all things that we have seen our allies do, and these are things that I think Canada should be doing as well.
I want to stick with you. There's something sort of unique in this situation. When these hacks happen, we sometimes don't know who's behind them, but that's not the case in this attack. How come?
I actually think we often do know, but we don't necessarily want to attribute for a number of reasons. One is that it can be hard to do an attribution, right? When you can look at the kind of software and malware programs that these hackers are using, and often there's traces of them that can identify who these actors actually are. If it's a new group, it might take some time. It might not be possible. But I would actually say probably in more cases rather than not, we probably can, but we don't always choose to do so. And there have been a number of attacks in Canada recently where we have not seen attribution. So, for example, we believe, it's never been, I believe, confirmed by the government, that there was a devastating ransomware attack against the Newfoundland healthcare system, for example. That has never been attributed. Global Affairs Canada was hacked last year in the run-up to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That has never been attributed, and in fact, never been identified. We really haven't learned much about that attack at all. And then we have this particular attack, which we've only really learned about because of the leak of intelligence by a very misguided 21-year-old in the in the Air Force National Guard in the United States. So, it's hard to say. It is ultimately not the decision of the Cyber Center to make these attributions. It's ultimately a diplomatic decision. It's a decision that has to be taken by politicians. But I think it's important to do these attributions simply because, it calls out bad behavior. If a state's doing something that is ultimately going to be harmful, not just for Canada, but for other states who may see this kind of attack and want to replicate it, that's an important thing to call out. And as Rajiv said earlier, the NotPetya attack, affected, I think, 60 countries. When these attacks happen, they can be used really irresponsibly. So Canada, as a country that often likes to describe itself as supporting the rule of law, this is something we absolutely should be doing. And like I said, it's while in some very minimal cases it might be hard to identify who these actors are, I do think ultimately, Canada is pretty good at figuring out and working with our allies and trying to see who, in fact, is doing these attacks.
Rajiv, you get the last question here. How can oil and gas companies bolster their protection against state-sponsored cyber threats, Russian or otherwise?
Yeah, so it was nice to hear, the steps that Bhushan was taking at Enbridge. Those are excellent steps, and it's amazing that we have organizations that are building that resilience into their program. From our side, we always say, start with some of the basics, and that's, patching your internet-facing applications and making sure that they won't be exploited by those, common vulnerabilities that are out there. Strengthening your administrative privileges and your identity system. So multi-factor authentication is fantastic, and making sure that you're zoning your networks properly so that, those operational technology services aren't exposed to the internet and are sequestered in a much more secure zone. So the threat actors get into the network, they don't get to those critical systems that can actually cause physical damage, right? So those are the basics right there. Having an incident response plan. That's for some organizations don't, usually the smaller ones, but at the same point in time, very important. And then when you get into ransomware and these sorts of things, being able to back up your data appropriately and store it in a secure spot so that you're not at the mercy of the ransomware cyber criminals that are going to want to try to extort you for money, and making sure that you're in a good response and recovery position should something happen. And so cyber resilience is really what we preach. And that's basically being able to prevent, detect, respond, and recovery. No one's going to be perfect, but being resilient is really the important element.
All right, we are going to leave it there. Rajiv, Bhushan, Stephanie, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Great. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.